Well, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us. Outrageous and pure anti-Semitism. Well, that's what Israel's prime minister is calling a decision made against the Jewish state by the International Criminal Court. The ruling is part of a probe against Israel and Hamas for alleged war crimes.
Well, the court has no enforcement authority regardless of its decision. So what's this action really all about? Chris Mitchell explains from Jerusalem.
Several years ago, Palestinians asked the ICC to investigate Israel for war crimes. Last month, judges decided they had jurisdiction over the area known as the West Bank and Gaza. Fatou Bensouda, the prosecutor driving this investigation, focuses on the 2014 Gaza war. While she calls out Hamas for crimes such as attacking Israeli civilians and using its own people as human shields, Bensouda also charges Israel responded too strongly, leaving dead and wounded Palestinians in its wake. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu slammed the prosecutor's decision.
I think this is an outrageous decision that goes against the one democracy in the Middle East, Israel, whose soldiers honorably and scrupulously do everything to avoid civilian casualties as they're fighting the worst terrorists on earth. This is pure anti-Semitism.
The prosecutor also expands her charges to the so-called occupied territories, which refers to Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria and eastern Jerusalem.
I'm in Jerusalem, not very far from the old city of Jerusalem, which has been our capital since the time of King David for 3,000 years. They say that if we build a house in Jerusalem, that's a war crime. The ICC, the International Court, was built to prevent the kind of horrors that were committed on the Jewish people by the Nazis, and now they're turning their guns on the one and only state of the Jewish people.
Hamas welcomed the decision as a step forward to implement justice.
Hamas stresses clearly and decisively that the resistance by our Palestinian people and all the resistance by the national factions in Palestine are a legitimate resistance, and its natural role is to resist the occupation and restore the land and the holy places according to all international laws.
Defense Minister Benny Gantz, who could also be a target of the investigations, says the ICC probe rewards terrorism and terror organizations.
Israel is the only situation where the court is investigating a non-member state at the behest of a member, the Palestinian Authority, which is not a state.
International law expert EUGENE Kontorovich says regardless of any decision against Israelis, the court has no enforcement authority. He adds, however, the impact would be on the world stage.
What this really is about is the Palestinians seeking to establish the fact of their statehood and their maximalist borders outside of negotiations. So the Palestinians, they don't need anything else to happen for them to have already won.
Kontorovich says, bottom line, Israel should not even address the charges since the court has no jurisdiction over it.
But Israel should definitely ignore it. It should treat it as a hostile political entity.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, let's go back into history as to how did this International Criminal Court start? Well, it started back in 2002, and its prime purpose was to investigate genocides coming out of Africa, and in that charge people with war crimes, whether it was the use of child soldiers or massacring people in a genocide just because of they were of a different tribe, a different ethnic group. Well, it's now evolved, and let's take a look at who is this chief prosecutor, and her name, Fatou Bensouda. She is from Gambia. Gambia is over 90% Muslim, so she is Muslim. She's very prominent that she's a Muslim believer. So would you expect a Muslim believer to give Israel justice in the International Criminal Court? And the answer, I think, is quite clearly no. To give you more background, she has been banned from the United States. Her visa was revoked 2 years ago. The State Department revoked it because she was trying to charge U.S. soldiers with war crimes, U.S. generals with war crimes for activity in Afghanistan. And so she has been placed on a no-entry list, as well as her assets, and anyone that does business with her is also subject to sanctions by the U.S. State Department. So that's who we're dealing with, and that's the headline beneath this headline. There is no actual jurisdiction, there is no actual enforcement power by this International Criminal Court, but they do get a headline, and in that headline they try to smear Israel. Here's a question for you. If you were living in a city that was subject to rocket attacks from another location, would you ever expect to be charged with war crimes for trying to stop those rocket attacks? Well, that's exactly what's happening here. In other news, President Biden is under increasing pressure over his immigration policy. Republicans say there's a crisis on the southern border. John Jessup has that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
Thanks, Gordon. But the Biden administration doesn't agree with that characterization, instead calling what's happening at the border a challenge. But Republicans are demanding hearings on how the White House is handling the situation. CBN's Dale Hurd has the story.
The Biden administration refuses to call the growing number of unaccompanied minors on the southern border a crisis, although documents uncovered by Axios indicate the White House already knows border resources are overwhelmed. Internal documents from the Department of Health and Human Services show the number of child migrants crossing the border last week surged to an average of 321 children per day, compared to just 47 per day during the last days of the Trump administration. Texas Congressman Michael McCall told Fox that the White House has sent the wrong signal to child traffickers.
I'm just telling you, the green light is on now. We're open for business again, and it's the worst message to be sending to the traffickers who are smuggling these kids across the border. To see a 45% spike will take us back to the Obama administration all over again.
CBN contributor Chuck Holton is in Colombia, where migrants are lining up for the dangerous journey through several nations to get to the United States.
So the question is, why don't they stop in Chile or Ecuador or Brazil or Colombia or any of the other countries in Central America that they cross before they get to the United States? And there's two reasons for that. One is that opportunities are better in the United States for them. And number two, they say, now is the time to go because Joe Biden is the president.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott is also accusing the White House of creating a health crisis in his state by allowing migrants with COVID-19 into the country without proper testing and quarantines.
The Biden administration was spreading COVID in South Texas yesterday because of their lack of constraint of testing and quarantining people who'd come across the border illegally.
The Washington Post says the Biden administration is planning to create quick processing centers that would release adult migrants and children into the U.S. within 72 hours. Meanwhile, White House officials are reportedly planning a trip to the border this weekend. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Thanks, Dale. President Biden called off a second airstrike in Syria last week. The United States launched an earlier strike against militias backed by Iran on February 25th in retaliation for a rocket attack against a base housing U.S. soldiers in Iraq. News reports say the U.S. had planned to hit another target in Syria. Then, with planes in the air, intelligence reported that women and children had been spotted at the second location. The president was informed and called off that attack. Well, here at home, another problem for New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. Some of his top aides changed a state health department report last year to hide the true number of people who were killed by COVID-19 in the state's nursing homes. The Wall Street Journal and the New York Times stories are the latest to show how the Cuomo administration hid the true number of deaths. The original health department report indicated more than 9,000 people died, but Cuomo aides changed that to just over 6,400. State officials say the edits were only made because of concerns about accuracy, not to protect Cuomo's reputation. The stories come as the governor is also facing allegations of sexual harassment. Well, a late night for senators here in Washington as Democrats work to push through their nearly $2 trillion COVID relief package. That as the number of people getting vaccinated accelerates and more states lift restrictions. Jennifer Wishon has that story.
President Biden says vaccines should be available to every American adult by Memorial Day. And across the country, people are lining up to get their shots.
When I leave here today, I'm going to be like, yes, I made it.
A thankful Grace Berry is one of the 54 million Americans who've received at least one dose of the vaccine, as mass vaccination sites like this open across the country.
We expect that we're going to come close, if not exhaust, our 3,000 vaccine allotment for the day.
And a number of states are lifting restrictions.
This is our plan starting on March 19th.
Governor Ned Lamont of the blue state of Connecticut announcing he's lifting nearly all limits on businesses, returning to full capacity at restaurants, hair salons, and gyms. 5 states have lifted mask mandates, including Texas.
Texans have mastered the safe strategies. They don't need an order from Austin, Texas, telling them what to do.
In Washington, Senate Democrats scrambled to make last-minute changes to the president's $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill to guarantee unanimous Democrat support. The measure attempts to nurse the economy by providing direct payments of up to $1,400 to most Americans, and it aims to tackle the virus with money for vaccines, tests, and help for schools. Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says the bill is needed to combat the deadly COVID crisis. But Republicans argue it disregards improving conditions on the ground and is loaded full of pork. To prove the point, Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson pulled a procedural move that forced Senate clerks
The table of contents for this act is as follows.
to read the entire 628-page bill aloud. Republicans point to nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates that economic growth will exceed a strong 4% this year, even without the president's stimulus package.
This is not a COVID bill. 9% of this bill focuses on COVID health spending. 91% is a partisan wish list paying off the Democratic special interests that got them elected.
Conservatives also worry the bill will add to the already exploding national debt. The CBO projects the debt is to almost double over the next 30 years to twice the size of the entire economy. And that estimate doesn't take into account this latest nearly $2 trillion proposal by the president. Jennifer Wishon, CBN News.
Thanks, Jennifer. Gordon?
Well, we keep spending money at an unbelievable pace, and $2 trillion is a lot of money. And you better have a very good reason for it, because at the end of this road of all this spending, you literally put our currency at risk. The reason we're able to do this, the reason we're able to literally print the money to pass the bill, to say we're going to send $2 trillion out, is that we're the reserve currency of the world. The dollar is the benchmark against which all other currencies are pegged. When we lose that, well, watch out below. China is already making plans to change things, and they're already moving into digital currency. And they certainly aim at becoming the reserve currency of a digital marketplace. So that's what they're planning to do. When that happens, what's going to happen with 30 trillion in debt, 40 trillion in debt? Our economy won't be able to sustain it. The dollar will dramatically lose its value. And that's a price that you and I will pay with massive inflation. You can go back in history. There are a lot of different examples, whether it was Brazil a couple of decades ago or Germany in the 1920s. What happens to a country where inflation gets out of control? And that is a situation none of us wants to face. How can we solve this? Well, I think one way is to, well, please, can we stop overspending? Number two is for the existing debt, and this is debt that is largely owned by the U.S. Federal Reserve. So that means we own the debt and we're obligated under the debt. And can we have some kind of bill that reconciles that and say, well, let's have a jubilee. Let's forgive ourselves for this overspending. And then can we please resolve that we won't ever do it again?